The wind came down from the ridges with the sound of a dying animal. It was a lonesome sound, a hungry sound. It clawed at the chinks of the old cabin where Abigail Hartwell lay shivering, not from the cold, but from a fear that was older and deeper than any winter. Her breath was a shallow thing. Her belly was round and full under the thin patchwork quilt. The life inside her was a promise and a curse, the last warm thing in a world that had gone cold. She'd been cast out. The town of Redemption had no room for a woman with a secret she couldn't hide. The man who'd whispered promises to her under a summer moon had vanished like smoke. His letters stopped. His name became a poison on the lips of the righteous. Sheriff Amos Rohr himself had delivered the final judgment. "A woman makes her choices," he'd said, his eyes as hard as frozen earth. "And she must live with them." His words had been her exile. She had climbed into these unforgiving hills, to this forgotten cabin, to live with her choice. Alone. The fire in the hearth was dying. The last of her wood. The last of her hope. She pressed a hand to her belly, a silent plea to the child who would soon enter this merciless world. The baby shifted, a small flutter of life in the darkness, and then she heard it. Not the wind, not the groaning of the old wood. A sound deeper, more deliberate. The crunch of a heavy boot on frozen snow. Abigail froze, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Wolves prowled these slopes, but wolves did not walk like men. She reached for the iron poker by the hearth, her fingers numb and trembling. The door creaked open. A swirl of snow, and then a figure, a mountain of a man who blocked out what little light remained. His shoulders were broad beneath a buffalo hide coat. His beard was thick with frost. His eyes, gray as river stone, swept the room and landed on her. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The storm howled behind him, a furious, impatient thing. "What do you want?" Abigail's voice was a ragged whisper, lost in the wind. The man said nothing. He reached into a satchel slung across his chest and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it on the small table by the door. Jerked venison, hard bread, a small tin of coffee. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the storm and was gone. The door banged shut behind him, and the silence he left was heavier than the storm itself. Abigail didn't move for a long time. She stared at the bundle on the table, her mind reeling. It was food, enough to last for days. But it wasn't a gift. She knew that much. In this world, nothing was free. This was a debt, and she had no idea how she was going to pay it. The next morning, the world was a blinding expanse of white. Abigail forced herself to the creek, her legs trembling on the icy path. As she knelt by the water, she felt it again, the feeling of being watched. She turned sharply. Across the clearing, half hidden among the black pines, stood the man. He was as still as the trees around him, a silent sentinel in the snow. She remembered the whispers from town. Jonah McGraw, a soldier who'd come back from the war with shadows in his eyes. A man who'd turned his back on the world and gone to live in the hills like an untamed animal. They said he had blood on his hands. They said he preferred solitude to salvation. His gaze was steady, unreadable. She clutched her bucket and scrambled back to the cabin, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. She barred the door, but she knew it was useless. A bar of wood wouldn't stop a man like that. That night, another bundle appeared on her doorstep. She hadn't heard him come or go. This time it was split logs, dry kindling, and a piece of salt pork. She brought them inside, her heart a tangled mess of gratitude and fear. She didn't want charity. She didn't want a witness to her shame. But as the fire roared back to life, warming the small cabin, she knew she was too weak to refuse. The gifts were a chain, each one binding her a little tighter to the silent man on the mountain. What did he want from her? Why was he keeping her alive? The question gnawed at her, more persistent than the hunger had been. The days fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Every morning, a new offering. A jar of honey, a coil of rope, a soft fur pelt to put between her and the cold floor. He never showed himself, but his presence was everywhere. In the neatly stacked wood, in the tracks that appeared and disappeared in the snow. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to throw the gifts back into the snow, but her body and the life inside it betrayed her. She ate the food, she burned the wood, she slept under the fur, and with each act of survival, the debt grew heavier. One afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, weak but hopeful. She ventured outside, gathering snow to melt for water. The world suddenly tilted, the trees spinning into a blur. She leaned against the cabin wall, a wave of dizziness washing over her. When her vision cleared, he was there. Not hiding in the trees, but standing in the middle of the clearing, an armload of wood in his arms. He stopped, his gray eyes flicking over her, taking in her swollen belly, her pale face, her trembling hands. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to leave her alone, but the words caught in her throat. He said nothing. He walked to the cabin, set the wood neatly beside the door, and then crouched to split it with a practiced, powerful rhythm. The axe rose and fell, each strike a clean, sharp sound in the winter silence. He didn't look at her again. When the work was done, he gave a single curt nod and walked back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had come. That night, Abigail sat by the fire, her hands resting on her belly. She thought of the women in town, their sharp, judgmental eyes. Lydia Pike, whispering her disgrace to anyone who would listen. They would never understand this. The quiet mercy of a man who lived beyond their laws, beyond their forgiveness. His silence was more of a comfort than any of their prayers had ever been. But the question remained, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. Why? A man like Jonah McGraw didn't do things without a reason. He was a ghost, a legend, a killer, some said, and he was keeping her alive for a purpose. She was beginning to fear that she wouldn't know that purpose until it was too late. Winter tightened its grip, squeezing the life out of the mountains. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the world in a silent, white shroud. Abigail felt the child turning inside her, a restless, urgent thing. Fear was a constant companion, a shadow that sat with her by the dying fire. She tried to prepare. She gathered what clean cloths she had. She kept a kettle of water near the hearth. But her hands trembled, and her mind was a fog of exhaustion and dread. Jonah seemed to sense her growing panic. He stopped leaving the gifts on her doorstep and started spending his days nearby, a silent, watchful presence. He would chop wood, reinforce the cabin walls, his work a steady, reassuring rhythm against the howl of the wind. He began to leave a portion of his own cooked meal on a plate for her each evening. He was no longer just a provider. He was a guardian. The storm that would change everything arrived without warning. It came in the dead of night, a furious blizzard that hammered the cabin with fists of ice and snow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof, trying to claw its way inside. Abigail woke in the darkness to a pain so sharp, so deep, it stole her breath. It was time. Her cry was thin and raw, lost in the roar of the storm. But he heard it. Jonah was there in an instant, his large frame filling the small room. He knelt beside her, his rough hands hovering, uncertain. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Raw, naked fear. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice a low, taut rumble. Through gritted teeth, through waves of agony, she tried to tell him. Words half remembered from the old midwife in town. Breathing, pushing. Sweat poured from her, soaking the thin quilt. Jonah moved with a desperate urgency, boiling water, tearing cloth into strips. His hands, which could split a log with a single blow, were trembling as he tried to follow her ragged instructions. The hours bled together, a fever dream of firelight, pain, and the ceaseless roar of the storm. The cabin felt like the last safe place on Earth, a tiny, fragile ship in a raging sea. And through it all, Jonah's voice was her anchor. "Hold on, Abigail," he murmured, over and over. The words were a lifeline, a rope thrown to her as she was pulled under by the waves of pain. Just hold on. And then, with one last, tearing cry that seemed to rip the world in two, the child was born. In the sudden, ringing silence, a new sound emerged, a fragile, wavering cry. Jonah caught the tiny, slippery body in his great hands, his own breath catching in his throat with a shuddering sob. He looked at the newborn, and something in his hard, weathered face broke open. Awe. Wonder. He wrapped the baby in a clean cloth and placed it gently in Abigail's arms. She looked down, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with exhaustion, and a love so fierce it felt like another kind of pain. "A boy," she whispered. "He's alive." Jonah sank back on his heels, his broad chest rising and falling, the weight of the last few hours pressing down on him. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different storm had broken. One of life and terror and fierce, bloody survival. He sat in the chair by the fire, his gaze fixed on the mother and child. For years he had been a ghost, hiding from the world, burying his own grief under a mountain of solitude. But tonight, life had forced its way back in. It had demanded his hands, his strength. It had demanded his heart. As the firelight danced on the rough log walls, Abigail saw something on her newborn son's shoulder, a small, distinctive birthmark, a tiny crescent moon, a birthmark she had seen once before, on the shoulder of the man who had abandoned her, the man who was the sheriff's son. And when she looked up, she saw that Jonah was staring at it too. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were full of a terrible dawning recognition. He knew. He knew who the father was. And suddenly, his kindness, his protection, it wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a judgment. The days after the birth were a quiet, fragile truce. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured and clean. Jonah stayed, his presence a constant, unspoken question. He cared for them with a rough, clumsy tenderness, but a new distance had settled between them. He knew. The knowledge was a wall of ice. Abigail held her son, whom she named Samuel, close. She watched Jonah as he moved about the cabin, his face a grim, unreadable mask. His kindness now felt heavy, laced with a purpose she couldn't decipher. Was it pity, guilt, or something darker? The need for supplies finally forced them from their mountain sanctuary. The town of redemption lay below, a place Abigail had hoped never to see again. But the baby needed cloth, and she needed flour. There was no choice. Jonah harnessed his mule, his movements precise and silent. He walked beside her down the winding path, his long stride steady, his silence a shield. When they entered the general store, the world stopped. Every conversation died. Every head turned. The women of the town stared, their eyes taking in Abigail, the baby in her arms, and the fearsome, silent man at her side. Lydia Pike, her face a pinched mask of righteousness, was the first to speak. Her voice cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "Well, look what the storm blew in," she said, her eyes fixed on the baby. "Carrying your sin for all to see, Abigail. And with that animal." A murmur went through the crowd. Abigail felt her face flush with shame. She clutched Samuel tighter, lowering her eyes. But Jonah didn't move. He simply stood there, his great height and broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the room. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His gaze, as cold and hard as the mountain stone, swept over the faces of the women. One by one, they looked away. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, not with judgment, but with fear. Abigail gathered her supplies, her hands shaking. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. She paid the storekeeper, his own eyes darting nervously toward Jonah. They left the store and walked back into the cold, bright sunlight. As they passed the sheriff's office, the door opened. Sheriff Amos Rohr stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His eyes, cold and calculating, were not on Abigail. They were on Jonah. "McGraw," the sheriff said, his voice a low warning. "You'd do well to remember your place. Some things are best left buried in the hills." Jonah stopped. He turned slowly to face the sheriff. The two men stared at each other across the dusty street, a silent, deadly challenge. "He's my son," the sheriff said, his voice dropping so only they could hear. "Whatever trouble you're thinking of starting, I'll finish it." It was a confession, and a threat. Jonah's face was unreadable. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, and then turned and continued walking, his hand resting on the hilt of the large knife at his belt. Abigail's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about her shame anymore. This was about power. The sheriff was protecting his son, the man who had fathered her child and left her to die. He had used the town's judgment as a weapon to drive her away, to erase his family's mistake. And Jonah was not just a hermit. He was a threat to that power. His quiet protection of her was an act of defiance, an act the sheriff would not tolerate. Back in the cabin, the silence was thick with unspoken truths. Abigail sat by the fire, rocking her son, her mind a whirlwind of fear. "He'll kill you," she said softly, the words catching in her throat. "The sheriff, he won't let you protect us." Jonah stood by the window, looking out at the vast, unforgiving wilderness that had been his home. "He's not the first man who's tried," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. He turned from the window, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the war in his eyes, the ghosts he carried. "Samuel Rohr, the boy you knew. He was my captain in the war." The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. "He was a coward," Jonah continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He left good men to die on the battlefield to save himself. I was the only one who saw, the only one who survived. So that was it. The reason for his exile, the reason for his silence. He had been carrying the truth of the town's golden boy, the sheriff's heroic son, for years." "They buried the truth," Jonah said. "Gave him a medal, made him a hero. And they sent me to the hills, with whispers of madness and blood on my hands, to make sure no one would ever listen to my story." Abigail looked from Jonah's haunted face to the sleeping child in her arms. This baby, her Samuel, was the living proof of the so-called hero's real character. He was a link to a past the sheriff would do anything to keep buried. And Jonah hadn't been helping her out of pity. He was protecting the last piece of a truth he had almost died for. He was protecting the son of the man he hated most in the world. And now the sheriff was coming to erase them all. The thaw came, but it brought no relief. With the melting snow, the threat from the town grew more real. Abigail would see riders on the distant ridges, watching the cabin, the sheriff's men. They were waiting. Jonah became a restless, caged animal. He spent his days fortifying the small cabin, reinforcing the door, checking his rifle. The peace they had found in the heart of the storm was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. He started talking more, telling her stories of the war, of the men who had died because of Samuel Rohr's cowardice. He spoke of their families, of the letters he'd helped them write, of the promises he'd made to see that they were remembered. He was not just a soldier. He was a keeper of the dead. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the firelight, he pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his pocket. He opened it. Inside was a faded picture of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "My wife," he said, his voice rough. "She died while I was at war. The fever. I never got to say goodbye." He closed the locket with a snap. Samuel Rohr was supposed to deliver my letters to her. He was on leave, but he never did. He threw them away. I found them, months later, in a burned-out supply wagon. He couldn't even be bothered. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Samuel hadn't just been a coward. He was a man with a hollow space where his soul should have been. I promised her I'd come home, Jonah whispered, his gaze lost in the fire. But the man who came back wasn't the man who left. Abigail understood then the true depth of his wound. It wasn't just the war. It was the betrayal. The loss of his wife. The loss of his honor at the hands of a man the world called a hero. Protecting her, protecting this child, was his last chance to keep a promise. His last chance to find a piece of the man he had been. The confrontation came on a bright spring morning. The air was full of the smell of pine and thawing earth. Abigail was outside, hanging cloths to dry, with the baby sleeping in a basket at her feet. 4 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Rohr, his son Samuel, and 2 deputies. They dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate. This was not a social call. "Abigail," the sheriff said, his voice smooth as oil. "We've come to help you. A woman and a child can't survive up here alone. We've arranged a place for you. A good place. Far from here." It was an order, not an offer. They were here to erase her. "I'm not leaving," Abigail said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood in front of the basket, a mother protecting her young. Samuel Rohr, the handsome, charming man who had promised her the world, looked at her as if she were a stranger. There was no recognition in his eyes, no remorse, only a cold, annoyed impatience. "Don't be a fool, Abigail," he said. "This is for the best." The cabin door opened. Jonah stepped out, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He didn't raise it. He just stood there, a silent, immovable object. "This doesn't concern you, McGraw," the sheriff warned, his hand moving to his pistol. "This is a family matter." "That's where you're wrong, Amos," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "This is about the men you left to die at Willow Creek." The sheriff's face went pale. Samuel flinched as if he'd been struck. "This is about the letters you never delivered," Jonah continued, his eyes locked on Samuel. "About a woman named Sarah who died waiting for a word from her husband." He took a step forward. "You buried the truth once. You're not going to do it again." "You're insane," Samuel stammered. "The war, it broke your mind." "My mind is clear," Jonah said, "and I have proof." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "Corporal Miller's diary. He saw it all. He wrote it all down before he bled out in my arms. He made me swear I'd see it delivered to his wife." He held up the journal. It describes, in detail, how Captain Samuel Rohr fled the battle, leaving his men to be slaughtered. The sheriff drew his pistol. "Give me that book, McGraw." "No," Jonah said, his voice flat. "The lies end today." The clearing was silent, the air thick with tension. The deputies shifted nervously, their eyes darting between the sheriff and the mountain man. And in that moment of hesitation, Abigail did something no one expected. She picked up her baby and walked forward, right into the space between the armed men. She stopped in front of Samuel Rohr and held the child up for him to see. "Look at him," she said, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. "Look at your son. Look at the life you tried to throw away." Samuel stared at the child, at the tiny, perfect face, at the crescent moon birthmark on his shoulder. And for the first time, something in his cold, empty eyes flickered. It might have been shame. It might have been regret. It was the first crack in the wall of lies. And it was all Jonah needed. The standoff in the clearing was a silent war, fought with memories and shame. The sheriff's authority, once absolute, was crumbling under the weight of Jonah's truth and Abigail's courage. His deputies, men who had followed his orders without question for years, were now looking at him with doubt in their eyes. "This is a lie," the sheriff blustered, his pistol still aimed at Jonah. "The ravings of a madman. He's trying to tarnish a war hero's name." "Then let's ride into town, Amos," Jonah said, his voice calm and steady. "Let's read Corporal Miller's diary in the public square. Let's see who the people of redemption believe. A man who hides behind a badge, or a man who died for his country." The threat was clear. The sheriff's power was built on a foundation of lies. Exposing his son would destroy them both. He looked at Samuel, his son, the golden boy, who was now staring at his own child with a look of dawning horror. The perfect life he had built was about to be washed away. "Put the gun down, father," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking. "It's over." The sheriff hesitated, his face a mask of fury and desperation. Then, with a shuddering breath, he slowly lowered his pistol. The fight was gone. Defeated not by a bullet, but by the truth. He looked at Abigail, at the child, and then at Jonah. His eyes were full of a hatred so pure it was terrifying. He said nothing. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a broken man leaving the ruins of his life behind. Samuel and the deputies followed, leaving Abigail and Jonah standing in the silent clearing. The power of the Rohr family was broken. The whispers and judgments of the town would now turn on them. Abigail was no longer the outcast. She was the survivor, the one who had stood against them and won. In the weeks that followed, the story trickled out. The truth of Samuel Rohr's cowardice, of the sheriff's cover-up. The town of Redemption was forced to look at itself, at the cruelty it had shown, at the lies it had chosen to believe. Lydia Pike and her gossiping friends fell silent. Men who had once looked at Abigail with scorn now averted their gaze in shame. Abigail and Jonah did not go back down the mountain. They didn't need the town's forgiveness. They had forged their own world in the wilderness, a world built on loyalty and a hard-won peace. The cabin, once a symbol of exile, became a home. Jonah built a cradle for the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the soft wood. He taught Abigail how to track, how to read the signs of the forest. She taught him how to laugh again, a sound that had been buried in him for too long. They never spoke of love. They didn't need to. It was in the way he watched her as she sang to the baby. It was in the way she mended his coat, her stitches neat and strong. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, born not of promises and moonlight, but of fire and storms and survival. One evening, as the sun set, painting the peaks in shades of purple and gold, they stood on the small porch, the baby cooing softly in Abigail's arms. "He looks like you," Jonah said, his gaze on the child. Abigail smiled. "He has your strength." Jonah reached out, his calloused finger gently touching the baby's cheek. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "the world breaks you in all the right places." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. The wind swept down from the ridges, but it no longer sounded like a wounded thing. It sounded like a promise, a whisper of a future she had never dared to imagine. The storm that had threatened to destroy her had in the end saved her. It had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life. A life remade from the ashes, stronger and more beautiful than anything she had known before. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have more tales of the frontier, where the greatest treasures are not found in gold, but in the courage of the human heart.